Hey guys, you're listening to episode 174 of the Finish Line podcast, where we discuss the intersection of faith, generosity, and personal finance. My name is Cody, and I'm here with my co-host and brother, Keelan. What does it look like for families to move towards deeper alignment and generosity together? In this episode, we are joined by Kristin Hammett, Vice President of Family Generosity Services at the Signatry. Kristin has spent her career helping families move from reactive giving to intentional stewardship rooted in faith. Drawing from deep experience on both the nonprofit and giver sides, she now guides families towards alignment, trust, and faithfulness in how they move towards intentional generosity together. She is clear that generosity is not just about resources. It's about formation, legacy, and learning to listen together for where God is leading. If you're wrestling with how to give together wisely, this conversation is for you. Before we get started, I just wanted to ask one big favor of you guys. If you've been listening to the show for some time and want to support what we're doing, one very easy and free way to do that is to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Just write whatever you like about the show and you'll help others find us. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the show so you're the first to know when new episodes come out. And with that, let's get started. Well, we're here with Kristin Hammett. Kristin, thank you so much for taking some time to be with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate the conversations that you guys have on this podcast and really spur generosity. So I appreciate it.
So Kristin, take us back to your early years. Tell us a little bit about the home that you grew up in and how did you first come to know Jesus personally?
Thank you. I was blessed. I grew up in a believing home, two parents who loved Jesus, and that is truly the greatest blessing. Grew up on a farm in central rural Missouri. My parents still live there. I was the oldest of three children and grew up going to church every Sunday and youth group on Wednesdays. I can't tell you the date and time that I came to know Jesus as my Savior, but I do remember as a little girl in the innocence of childhood praying to ask Jesus into my heart. And really, certainly can't tell you that I followed a straight and narrow path my whole life, but always had that conviction of the Holy Spirit and learned to grow in my relationship with Him as I matured. So super blessed to have grown up in that way.
As you got older, college, or even into your career, where did you feel like that relationship in your faith really started to kind of direct the trajectory of where you were headed?
So I think that I really made a decision to walk a more straight, committed path midway through college. When I was choosing a big university, my mom had told me that in so doing, as she did, that I would need to really decide who I was. Because there are Christians everywhere, at small schools, at big schools, at Christian universities, and at liberal, large state schools. And I would need to make a commitment. And I still tried to live kind of both popular and having fun and going out, and also going to the student ministries, which I think is pretty common in a college experience. But as I just matured and realized, this is where I really make some key decisions for who it is that I want to be, really clung more deeply to my faith. And that set really the trajectory of my future steps in life.
Well, that sounds like some real wisdom from your mom. And I think that exploration, that's the process where our faith really becomes our own. And I'm sure many people had stories like that at that time in their life where they're really exploring who am I and what does it mean to have my own personal faith. Now, Kristin, you are heavily involved in the generosity world. Where were those seeds planted early on in your life?
So let's go back to that farm in central Missouri. That's where I first remember seeing generosity modeled. And what I can tell you is, as the daughter of a farmer, what I learned is how to live frugally. For those who are listening who may not be familiar with agriculture, when a farmer makes that sort of initial investment, it's in the spring, right? They're buying fertilizer, they're buying seed, they're tilling the ground, they're making investments in equipment, and they will not yield that harvest until late in the fall. And there are a lot of variables outside of their control. between when they buy that seed and that fertilizer and when they harvest that crop. And so that leads to a lot of frugality, a lot of trying to make that dollar stretch. Sometimes there's a bumper crop and sometimes it was not great at all. And so you have to learn how to budget and be prepared for either scenario or somewhere in between. So in all of that, what I can tell you that I remember seeing is on a monthly basis, my parents sitting at the kitchen table with a steno pad, kind of as their checkbook register, going through all of their bills and paying those bills. And I remember sometimes even sneaking to see kind of what some of those numbers looked like and being, just really shocked at the kind of expenditures that have to go out to support a farm. But what I also remember is seeing them write a check to church every month. So that taught me really a couple things. And I would say actually probably led me to a couple of assumptions. The first was really positive, and that was that giving isn't optional. We give. It's a discipline. It's something we do. The second one, and this isn't something my parents articulated or told me, it's really something I, again, assumed, and that is that it is obligatory. It is something that we associate with a bill. It is something we do because we have to. So I, kind of from an adult perspective now, the discipline I saw was fantastic. The association with an obligation versus joyful giving was something I had to overcome later. But I am super thankful for that model because it showed me how important giving is in the good years and the bad years. Whether we're spending a lot on the farm or a little, we are giving regardless. And that was a super important lesson. As my husband and I started our lives together, our marriage, he also came from a family that was disciplined in their giving and very supportive of their local church. So that really helped us from the get-go. There was never a really point of discussion. We tithed from the beginning. Now, did we have joyful hearts? That maybe came later, but it was certainly something that we knew was important. And in that case, in fact, was a discipline for us to continue to do. So that's what I would say is kind of where those seeds of generosity began, or at least the seeds of giving began in my life.
Now, one of the interesting things about your career is that you've spent time in the nonprofit space for quite a while, and now also really on the giver side, really representing givers. And so you have a very unique perspective into a lot of the dynamics of generosity. And I'd love to hear a little bit about what drew you to the nonprofit world early on.
Wow. How much time do you have, Keelan? I could take a while on this one. So let me go back really to that kind of when Mark and I got married. So my husband's name is Mark. We got married right out of college. I had just graduated. He'd been out for a year. And I was the breadwinner as we began our marriage. I got kind of the dream job at that time for me. And that was a sales role with a Fortune 50 company. And I had all the benefits. At that time, that meant a company car and a computer and just great benefits, right? Lots of travel, loved the people I worked with, just had some really wonderful initial career experiences and was really enjoying that and really thriving in many ways. And still, though, wondering, is this really what I want to do? I'm surrounded by great people. I love the paycheck. I'm the breadwinner. That's kind of fun. And this is what I went to school to do. I wanted this kind of a role. And at the end of the day, I'm selling consumer goods into retail stores. Is there more? And about that same time, we started a family. And I determined at that point, I couldn't do both. I wanted to be more present at home. I was fortunate enough to have a mom who worked, but she was in the school system. And so she was present. And I wanted some of those kinds of rhythms for our family. So I opted out, stayed at home at the same time that my husband was kind of entering into a commission-based role. And that was great. I mean, certainly faith building. We were still consistently giving. We were able to see some pretty fantastic things happen. This is where we also experienced some joy in our generosity by getting to do and really join God where he was doing some pretty neat things. But I was also kind of getting anxious, like there's more to be done. And I have some sales skills and some opportunity to offer these skills. How might that fit? And at the same time that our second daughter was a toddler, I was at church. There was a baby bottle campaign. For those of you who support a pregnancy center or involved in the pro-life space, that's a common fundraiser that happens at churches. You put your extra change or a check in that baby bottle and turn it back into that local pregnancy center. And I thought, I wonder if there might be an opportunity to volunteer there. So I found myself going through volunteer training and quickly realized I probably can't volunteer at the same time I'm paying for someone to watch my children. And then was able to become their first ever part-time development director. Now, as a development director, I really thought, first of all, I wasn't really sure what that was. Second, once I kind of figured out what it meant, it's fundraising, right? I really thought this is just using my sales skills that I already have. And God had a lot to teach me in that process. But that's how I got connected kind of with this idea of nonprofit development and givers. Just to share a little bit about what that story kind of looks like. And that is, as I was a pregnancy center part-time development director, figuring out what does this look like, I had an opportunity to go through a training with Mission Increase. And I had a light bulb moment around this concept of development. It's really not, you hear about a scarcity mentality. That's kind of what sales is, right? A scarcity mentality. I have to sell my product. In the development world, I have to get this donor with the amount of money that they have to give to my organization. And as I'm sitting in this Mission Increase training, what occurred to me and what was shared and really what sunk into my spirit is God has all the resources that he needs to fund his work. The role of the development director is to connect the resources that he's given to some, oftentimes business people, folks that are own companies or involved in real estate or have been wealth generators, and then those that are doing the work day in and day out, whatever that might look like, whether it is working in a pregnancy center and counseling with someone in a room, or feeding those that are insecure about where they're going to find their next meal, or rescuing those from a trafficking situation. The development director is the connection point between God's resources and his work. And that was a light bulb for me. That changed everything. When you realize that you are really connecting the resources and the work, the donors and the doers, that's a pretty incredible place to be.
Kristin, how did that perspective shift? Now you're seeing yourself as a vital component of the generosity giving process, where people that you would reach out to as a development director, instead of trying to get something from them, you're inviting them into something. How did that set the stage for what you're doing today?
It's really good. I love what you just said. I just wish I could underline it because it really is. It's a great posture. When you're a development officer, you are inviting people to join God where he's already at work. And if development officers and those in fundraising could sit in that posture and understand the great privilege that is, I think we would see a shift sometimes in what that dynamic looks like. To answer your question around how did that set the stage or how did that sort of create a path to what I'm doing today, it was really initially through that training at Mission Increase, which was sponsored through NCF at the time here in Kansas City, that I continued to connect more deeply with really the generosity space in all of Kansas City, connected well with the folks at NCF at the time, because their heart was to help connect the different local nonprofit ministry leaders with these resources to help them understand the perspective of connecting donors and doers. And just continue to build networks in the city. And Bill High, who is the founder of the Signatry, actually called me when the Signatry separated from NCF and did their own thing and said, hey, we're going to need somebody to keep a face in front of ministries during this transition. And I think you'd be great at it. At that time, I had stepped away from the pregnancy center development world. I was doing a little bit of consulting, but mostly a lot of volunteering. I had 3 kids and was trying to be present in their schools and doing all of the carpooling and shuffling. So I had some time and had a heart. My heart hadn't changed. My title perhaps changed a bit. So it was really a great opportunity for me to kind of step into that role that I had so appreciated several years before, to really equip nonprofit leaders and ministry leaders to that very posture, Cody, that you just said, that invitation, that opportunity to connect those resources and the work.
Yeah, I love that reframing. And I think when you make that shift from the nonprofit side, it completely changes how you just view every day that you go to work. And one of the interesting things about your background of seeing all these different dynamics from all the different sides, I'd love to hear, how do you think on the opposite side, givers kind of misunderstand nonprofits and the dynamic from the giver side? Where can we as givers grow in terms of how we partner with and respond and engage with ministries in a way that goes beyond kind of like a transactional interaction?
Here's what I would say. I think that there are a lot of donors who do want to go beyond, right? They want to engage in a deeper way than just writing a check or recommending a grant from their donor advised fund. I think there's a couple things that are important for donors to understand that I think they understand at varying degrees. The first one is it's important to understand the dynamics that are happening in the cause or that particular area, solving that particular problem. Even I still today have a lot to learn about some causes related to the obstacles they face, the timelines they are dealing with. And I like to see results quickly. I like to see impact quickly. And I think a lot of donors do too. They can often impact their results in their business fairly quickly, but they also understand those dynamics. And so to understand the dynamics of not just the organization, but sort of the dynamics of that cause is really important, because I think that helps them better understand appropriate expectations around impact. So I think that's my first one, is just understanding more about the cause so you have a better frame of reference to understand appropriate expectations around impact. The other thing, maybe that I don't know how popular this answer would be, but I feel pretty strongly about it, and that is consider impact before overhead. You know, we live in a world where folks are looking at 990s, or they're concerned with what the president of an organization is making. And my caution in that is that that's not the way we judge for-profit companies, right? We judge them on their profitability and their market share and their return. And so my encouragement would be to not completely disregard overhead as we think about nonprofits and ministries, but to look at impact and what they're accomplishing first. Because really, these are the most important problems that our world faces. Don't we want the most skilled people to go be working on them and focus their attention on them, not living on a shoestring? And so I think we need to just encourage folks to understand the problem, understand the dynamics at play so they can have realistic expectations around impact, and then put impact before overhead when you're looking at an organization that you want to support.
Yeah, I think that is a key point that you're making there, and one that I think there's been a growing number of voices bringing that very specific thing to attention. And honestly, if I think back, I think one of the reasons that dynamic has happened over the years is that it's just easier to look at a 990, get some quick, one or two little financial numbers and make all your decisions based off of that. Like if I could just look at all organizations and look at the percentage of incoming contributions that go to admin costs, and then the effective ones or whoever has the lowest number, that's easy to kind of wrap your head around, very straightforward. You can kind of flatten out all of the work that all organizations are doing, even across totally different causes. And, that's appealing as a giver to want it to be that simple. But the fact is, it's not that simple at all. And we're often comparing apples to oranges in doing that. And if we want to really empower an organization to be extremely effective, do we really want them to do it in the most minimal shoestring kind of way, or do we want them to do it right in the most helpful kind of way? And so I'm curious, since you brought it up, when you think of impact, what kinds of things come to mind? Like, what do you look for when you look at an organization in terms of actual impact?
Here's what I would say. It's not one size fits all, to your point on apples and oranges, right? Each cause is different. Even each organization can have different definitions of what they're measuring. And so it's important to ensure, at least as a donor, that you know what you're looking at. That requires some time and energy. And for those donor families listening, there are some of us out there working on trying to streamline some of those metrics so folks are measuring the same thing. We have agreed upon definitions. That's not going to happen overnight. It takes a lot of collaboration to get there. So when I look at impact, the first thing I want to know is, how do you define it? That's sort of the first question. The second question is it sustainable? I think that is a question that needs to be elevated really across causes. If we're looking at top line metrics, that tells some of the story. It doesn't tell the whole story. So we want to understand, if we've rescued someone from trafficking, what's the plan after that? And what steps are we taking to rehabilitate them and completely get them out of that situation? Or are they right back in that situation within, a month or a handful of days? Those are the kinds of questions, kind of goes back to a previous conversation we were having about understanding the cause. So we need to understand the cause. We need to understand the definition of the metric. And then my next question really is it sustainable? Help me understand. Those questions, just those two questions, require some due diligence on behalf of a donor. They aren't reported always in an annual report in a way to fully understand and get a good picture of what's happening. So my encouragement to donors is either work with a philanthropic advisor who's going to help you kind of do some due diligence, take the time to sit down with an organization and really understand this information on your own, or get with a cohort of donors where you can, in some type of giving circle or cohort environment, begin to ask these questions kind of as a group. And then that organization or cause will lean in and be a little more engaged and perhaps a little bit more motivated to get real answers to donors. But I think these are really important questions that require some time, and they require some investment on behalf of donors. So, at the Signatry, those are things that we're looking at, that we support a lot of organizations through the Signatry. So it requires due diligence on behalf of the donors as well.
Kristin, you mentioned Bill High, who we actually had on the podcast a little while back, and we also got to hear from Steve French.
Yeah.
Could you share, for listeners who aren't that familiar with the Signatry, just a little bit of the backstory and the work that you get to do today?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Signatry is a donor-advised fund, global Christian foundation. We started as part of National Christian Foundation, and then in 2018, separated and became our own really kind of boutique version with a little bit different business model, but essentially still the core business is to be a donor-advised fund sponsor and help donors really be generous with all that God has entrusted to them. So in America today, the majority of our giving happens from cash, while the majority of our wealth is in assets outside of cash. So when I work with nonprofit leaders, I often say, if we had an entire pie and you've got this whole pie is all the wealth, and you are asking only out of this tiny little sliver for the support for your organization, you're really not asking for all that God has entrusted to them. The donor is stewarding all of this. So let's begin to change the conversation, not just about cash, but instead about all of their assets, and help them understand how those are an opportunity for generosity. So that's really the sort of compelling case for the Signatry, is that we can help privately held business, real estate, donors that want to be generous really leverage all that God has entrusted to their care in that asset pool for generous purposes. And we've really been able to see some pretty remarkable, revolutionary generosity unlocked with families who say, yes, I want to take that step. I want to really steward or manage all that God has entrusted to my care and be able to impact the kingdom with it.
It's interesting to hear the way that you describe this phenomenon that has become reality, at least in our country. And it really builds on our discussion we were having just a few minutes ago about, as a development director, you got to invite people, and in your current role and through the Signatry, you get to share with people how to apply practical tools and wisdom to even enhance the giving that they're already doing. And I'm curious to hear from your perspective, how much of these conversations are educating donors about giving strategies, and how much of it is actually talking to organizations receiving assets about being prepared and taking those same steps?
I think there's always an opportunity for a ministry leader, when they're sitting with a donor that they have a trusted relationship with, to share this opportunity. What I will also tell you is it doesn't happen very often. And I think it doesn't happen because development officers or ministry leaders are worried about making their budget today. And they need to walk away from this conversation with a commitment for continued support. And when you talk about a non-liquid gift, so when you talk about a privately held business or real estate opportunities, that is a big picture idea. It may be 3, 5, 10 years out before that actually impacts your bottom line. And so I think there is a fear factor for a development officer or ministry leader to bring up something that, first of all, they don't know that much about. And secondly, it may jeopardize their ability to walk away with a gift. Now, what I would tell you on the flip side of that is what we have seen in reality is when a ministry leader brings it up, it actually further endears that donor to that ministry, because it tells them, you're looking at me with my greater interest in mind, right? Because this is a value add for the donor. You're really kind of being a consultant in some ways for a donor. You don't have to have all the answers. You just say, hey, before you sell that business, think it's important that you talk with someone about how you can give before the sale to save tax and be able to be even more generous. I know generosity is important to you. I don't want you to miss out on this opportunity. Just those little kind of clues and hints can be really helpful for a donor who has some pretty incredible opportunities down the road. And so I think if we can help ministry leaders overcome the fear of not getting an immediate check, we can see actually some pretty significant support down the line. And I think the check will still come. I think that cash gift will still happen. But what you're doing is planting seeds, right? You're starting to help them understand there's an opportunity. And you're not expected as a ministry leader to be the expert in that giving strategy. That's why there are organizations out there like the Signatry who can help come alongside both the ministry leader and the donor and help them understand what may or may not be a good solution for them.
Yeah, I love that. And I think you're 100% right. And that's why we have so many different types of people and experts, advisors, consultants in all these different areas to try to help walk givers through different aspects of the generosity journey.
Yeah.
One of the things as you're talking, when we think about how and when we actually do our giving, I think there's a couple different channels that giving moves. There's kind of quick, spontaneous gifts. A need shows up and you just meet that. There's what we call heartbeat giving, which is like your committed, continuous giving in partnership, local church or to a ministry. But then there's what we call milestone gifts. And that's some of like what you're talking about. Like these are gifts that you're not going to be able to make every year. This is like maybe a few times in your life you can make a gift like this. And not everybody gets to walk givers through that kind of an experience, but you and the Signatry get to be there in that moment often through that kind of an experience. And just from talking to lots of givers, there is a lot of dynamics at play through walking through that kind of a season or a decision. There's the whole financial and strategic side. How do I do this effectively? Take into account the tax situation, all these different factors on that side. There's also a very significant emotional side to it. This might be a business you've spent decades building or real estate you've had in the family for a long time. And then there's family dynamics at play, right? Maybe it's not just something that affects only you. It affects quite a few people that are directly related to you. And so I'd love to hear, your experience in just either walking with or seeing givers walk through this kind of a season or a decision. What are some of the factors that you see at play? And, where are some of the barriers or the pitfalls that have to come into consideration as somebody's thinking about a significant once in a lifetime kind of gift?
Yeah. I mean, Keelan, you're right. They oftentimes, these are, first of all, lifetime gifts. These are milestone gifts. They aren't going to happen often, perhaps only once in a lifetime. They've spent their entire life focused oftentimes on this particular thing, right? Particularly around a privately held business. So there are a lot of considerations at play. I think what we need to make sure that we think about fundamentally is not only the business and how are we going to hand that down, or what does that succession plan look like, but even more important than perhaps the business is what is my family prepared to tackle or to handle? Have I effectively prepared my family for this transition? So that's a lot for a business owner, a patriarch, oftentimes, perhaps a matriarch, to think through when they've been hard charging towards this business being successful the majority of their life. So I think the first thing is for them to not make any rash decisions right away. The Signatry is here to kind of help in those circumstances. The benefit right now for us is that our CEO sat in that seat and was, in fact, a previous business owner. He actually had several different businesses that he owned. And so that kind of conversation can be really valuable. What we have found is most important for anyone going through a really significant transition like that in that ultra high net worth kind of category is a trusted advisor. And so we not only are positioned to do that in some cases, but also share other advisor names with them who can walk through in a methodical way. How do we transition from that business being our driving force day in, day out to either passing it on to the family or selling it, and then we've passed on a great deal of wealth that now we have to have a plan around. So there's no cookie cutter. Every individual situation is a little bit different, but I think the key piece is to find an advisor that you can trust and that can sit and talk with you about what your goals are. What's the key objective? One of my favorite questions to ask a donor is, what is it for? It is a question that oftentimes garners a fair amount of silence because they haven't stopped long enough to think about that. And that's reasonable, right? Because they have been focused on generating income, building a business, creating opportunities for their family, but they haven't thought about what's the greater purpose. So what we really encourage families to do is to seek counsel. We're happy to come alongside families in that case, but also to take it slow and no urgency around particular decisions. Let's just find the right thing for you and take some time to seek what the Lord really has called you to do with what he's entrusted you to manage.
Kristin, I'm curious from your own experiences, what are some ways that you've seen generosity be something that an entire family embraces, and where have you seen it not play out that way?
I think the primary issue that arises when the wealth creator wants the family to engage in generosity together is that they have in their mind what it's going to look like, and that it will look like they want it to look. And so I think the first sort of counsel for a family as they begin this journey of engaging generosity together, talking about giving together, is to right set expectations. That it likely will not go exactly as planned. People are people, families are families, and there's oftentimes some complexity and disagreement in those families. So right setting expectations is really important. The second thing that I think is really important is for the person who's leading the conversation, oftentimes the wealth creator, the one who wants to get this, happening as a family, oh, wouldn't this be great? Is that they understand that alignment is more important than agreement. If you want everyone to give to the organizations or the causes that you want to give to, that's a very top-down approach, and it likely will not garner much enthusiasm from the rest of your family. But if you can instead hold it open-handed and prioritize alignment over agreement, and we might all find something together that we can get behind, you'll oftentimes find a lot more enthusiasm from the family. One story that I'll share just briefly is of a family who was diverse in thought. They viewed social issues differently, political issues differently. They all loved Jesus, but that was probably where the commonality ended, right? So the parents in that situation certainly could have said, this is what we're going to support. And the conversation would have likely felt very forced, felt very much like mom and dad just wanted to get us at the table so we could all say, okay, whatever you want to do. But instead, what they did was discovered the different causes or the different things that those family members, there were 3 kids involved, what they cared about. And then looking for opportunities where those might intersect with another. And honestly, it meant that in that case, the family found an organization and a cause that otherwise were not supporting and began supporting it together because it had something for everybody at the table, right? So you have this diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, yet they could all come together around a cause because there was something there. Now, 3 years later, that family is pretty excited and actually giving significantly more to that cause because they're all excited about it. So I think that's not going to work for every cause. Certainly, like the pro-life space, it's probably not going to be one that can unite a family that has diversity of thought. But there certainly are causes that can do that. I think that there's probably a plethora, but the ones that kind of come to mind for me are there's water, has a variety of things that it can provide a community. There's microfinance, there's education, health care. I mean, there are things that you can, as that wealth creator, as that family leader, can offer out as an opportunity to get your entire family kind of engaged and excited. But it really requires the leader of the family, the one who wants to drive this conversation, to be humble and willing to let go of their own ideals, right set expectations, and understand alignment over agreement is really our goal.
Yeah, I think that is great advice. And as you were sharing that, I was thinking through, when we think about trying to pick a focus area in general, whether as a whole family or even just on your own, in the beginning, there are some different kinds of maybe threads of connection that might draw us one way or another. But a lot of it is pretty moldable, I think. And it's really as we start that journey of getting engaged, starting to learn a lot more about a particular cause or something going on, like you were talking about earlier, and also getting in partnership with a ministry or multiple ministries working in the same space and building relationships there. That's really the glue that starts to spiral into a much greater level of generosity. And I think, what you're talking about, getting this alignment, if you can get that foundation early, it doesn't have to be perfect, because the actual journey is what's going to really solidify that. And it sounds like that's exactly what you saw in this family and probably many others. But I don't know what your thoughts are about that, kind of your starting point and trying to identify a focus area, whether individually as a couple or as a, multi-generational family, and then also the journey of it together and the dynamic that actually brings.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of untapped potential with finding a cause in an organization that you want to invest in deeply. You said something in that question that I just want to kind of highlight, and that was a partnership with a ministry, a partnership with a leader or an organization. And I think that's really important. It's important in all situations. It's critically important when we talk about deep investment or high net worth families. And, when we think about the sort of non-negotiable, these donors are operating really in a currency of trust. And so it is critically important that they trust that leader of the organization and those that they're engaging with. It's also important that the organization understand that this is a partnership. That idea of a trusted partnership is really, really key. I will never forget reading The Giver and the Gift by Peter Greer. He talks about the donor on this trip thanking him. And he was kind of nervous or confused, right? He was nervous about asking and then confused when he got the thank you. And it's because God has put a desire to build his kingdom on our hearts. And those that own businesses or are physicians or are doing what they are skilled to do are not able to do that frontline ministry work. But when there is a belief in a trusted partnership between that wealth creator who has a heart for the work and the organization that is accomplishing the work, that trusted relationship is really critical. And I think it can also play a critical role in this family dynamic, because ministry leaders then can say, we'd like to meet your whole family. We'd like to connect with the other generations. Can we come to an event, or can your whole family go with us on a vision trip or a mission trip? That's how we start sharing not only the passion for that particular cause, but the value of generosity in our families. So that idea of a partnership is something that I hope folks will take away from this conversation, and that is really critically important to organizations growing and to those donors investing in the work that those organizations are doing, when there's that trusted partnership that they engage in together.
So, Kristin, if you were to advise nonprofits on how to engage more deeply with donors and form those partnerships that you're talking about, what advice would you give?
Yeah, I think that maybe fundamental to my counsel to a nonprofit leader would be to view fundraising and development as ministry. I know when I was sitting in a development seat and raising money, I felt often as if I was the revenue stream so the ministry could happen. And there were kind of two sides of the organization, right? The one that was supposed to bring in the money and the one that was supposed to go do the ministry. And the reality is there's ministry happening on both sides of the organization. Because anytime that ministry leader is engaging with a donor and asking them to join this work, they're speaking to their resources, their finances, and their heart, right? The Bible says that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So when you are talking with a donor or their family, and you are learning what it is that is on their heart, what it is that they care about, and then connecting them to that work that's happening, that is ministry. So let's just dissolve that barrier between where the ministry happens and where the money comes in and realize it's all ministry. And I think that really sets up the organization to see it less as the dollars coming in and more as these people we get to engage with and minister to. So that would be my first thing, is that we view fundraising as ministry. That certainly changes the way a donor feels when they engage with you. As if you feel like you're doing ministry when you're engaging with them, you're building a relationship, you care about what they care about, you're learning about their family, it just completely changes the conversation. And then I think the other piece is that we need to remember that these donors have a lot of things going on in their world. And so the more that we can view them as holistic people, not a means to an end, but people who have needs, they have loss, they have celebration, they have interests, they have dynamics that happened in their life. I mean, we oftentimes talk about successful businesses. We have business failures too, right? That happen in the lives of these donors. So we need to commit to be in that ministry, in that relationship for the long haul. And that is what can really help build a relationship, build that trusted partnership. I have a development director friend who I had the opportunity to see in action. We were shooting a video one time of some families and talking, just about their experience and their passion for the cause. And as the development director is leaving and the donor is leaving, they're both kind of headed separate directions, would not see each other again in the coming days or weeks. They hugged and said, "I love you." And I thought, oh my goodness, like that's genuine. They care about each other. That doesn't happen overnight, but it happens when we see each other as people and we know that we're in partnership accomplishing God's work together. And we appreciate the role that each of us are playing in that work. So that's my encouragement to nonprofit leaders and ministry leaders, is view those donors as trusted partnerships and relationships that can really be lifelong and help you both accomplish what God's called you to do.
Yeah, I think that is beautifully said. And you said that in a way that I've never quite heard it put before, and especially as fundraising as ministry itself, like a whole separate realm of ministry. And I just had this picture in my mind as you were saying that of, you have the frontline staff, out there making sure the well gets dug, or that, the person is rescued, or the whatever is being done on the field. And, we think about that as where all the stories come from, right? As like, I saw this person light up when they finally had this experience or something, getting to see the end result of the work in the field. But at the same time, the development directors, and honestly, everybody at the Signatry and people that walk alongside givers like that, have the same stories. And it's often, I got to walk alongside this family as they made the biggest giving decision they've ever made in their life. Or I got to see this couple finally come together in unity in their giving in a way that they had always struggled to. And, it just happened that our organization or ministry or whatever was like the perfect bridge between their different giftings. And And those are the stories. That's the frontline work that you get to see. It's not just a means to an end. And it also ties back to something you shared at the very beginning on the giving side. When we view giving as an obligation, as like, how much am I supposed to be giving? If God has blessed me in this way or that, what am I supposed to be? How do I make sure I'm doing it right? And all this outward focused side. But generosity is deeply formational. It changes us at our core. It radically shapes our faith, what we trust, what we care about, how we love others. And everything that you're talking about here speaks into that formational kind of generosity of actually getting to see people changed through their giving. And we get to talk about that all the time on the podcast. But I think that is often a missing piece in just kind of the world out there. And I love that you, in all of the roles that you've been a part of, are bridging that gap between on the ministry side and on the giver side of really seeing how significant generosity is in bringing people together and shaping them as a whole.
It's really the point of it, don't you think? It's really the point of generosity. God doesn't need our money. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and he owns the hills. He can do whatever he wants to do. He instead chooses to allow us to be on our own adventure, to bumble around and figure it out and test him and realize he means what he says. And he says what he means. And he can be trusted. And so I think no matter how you turn that over and experience it and just test it, you'll find that it continues to form your heart, because that's what he's after. He doesn't need our money. He wants our hearts. And that's really, at the end of the day, that's the message of generosity, is he wants our hearts. Yeah, it's pretty beautiful.
This conversation is just reminding me of Philippians chapter 4, like the whole chapter. But I just want to read a couple sections that really highlight this dynamic that we're leaning into here. Paul says to the Philippians, "Not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only." And then a little further down, he says, "Not that I desire your gifts. What I desire is that more be credited to your account. I have received full payment and have more than enough." And a little further down, "And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus." He is talking to his donors.
Yeah.
But he doesn't see them as his means of doing the ministry. He's like, God's going to provide for you and for me. I love you.
Yeah.
I'm dedicated to you as my brothers and sisters. And Keelan and I were just talking about this recently. They supported him when he was in prison. Imagine if you got an impact report that said, "I'm sorry, the missionary you've been supporting is locked up. There's not a lot to report." And look what fruit came from that.
That's right.
We get to sit here thousands of years later, focusing on what a beautiful relationship they cultivated through the yes that they said to God's invitation.
So good, Cody. That's great. I really appreciate that.
Well, Kristin, we have been talking so much about givers of all kinds and all this formational journey that is really the generous life. I'm curious how that has played out in your own life and your own family. What has God done there? How has he shaped you through this journey?
So I shared earlier that I saw generosity and giving as a discipline modeled, and I'm super thankful for that. And it really set the stage for our giving as a couple when my husband and I got married. What I didn't see, or perhaps what I had not yet experienced, was the opportunity to give in addition to that disciplined giving, right? We were, as an early married couple, we were giving to our church. We were supporting a couple campus ministries that we'd benefited from. And we were in a rhythm of giving. And then our church pastor launched a building campaign. And he asked that we would go pray about a gift for above and beyond our best gift, right? We've all likely been exposed to some opportunity to invest in some kind of capital campaign. So as instructed, we were respectively praying about what our numbers should be. And perhaps this is not the best model of what I would recommend others to do, but Mark and I separately prayed, and then we didn't talk about it until it was Decision Sunday. And we were ready to make our commitments, right? So we're sitting in the parking lot at church on Sunday morning before walking in to make our commitment. And Mark looks at me and says, "What's your number?" And I told him I thought he should go first. And he said, "No, you should go first." And so I said my number, which I thought was a stretch, because this is beyond what we're already giving. And we're trying to live just off of my salary and save his and trying to be frugal and responsible. And so I gave a stretch number, and then he shared his, and it was twice what my number was. And we were newly married. Like, this is all new territory for us, and we're trying to figure it out. And frankly, I'm trying to figure out, as the kind of strong-willed woman, how do I submit to my husband and let him lead in this way? And I, again, not model behavior, but remember thinking, okay, Lord, if this doesn't work out, it's on him. This is his number. So we agreed to his number, which was twice mine. And we made that commitment, and that was on a Sunday. We didn't talk about it again. On Tuesday morning, I'm at work, I'm driving around in my sales territory, and he calls me and says, "Do you have a minute?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I just heard from our financial advisor, and I have a preliminary number on our tax return." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Are you ready for this?" And I said, "Yes." And he shared with me that our refund was going to be the difference between my commitment and his. So in 2 days, God showed up. I mean, truly, he knew beforehand, right? But in 2 days, he met me where I was at, and he showed me that I can be tested. In Malachi, it says that, "Test me in this," and he could be trusted. And that really, for us, set the trajectory for getting engaged in the generosity space, sharing what we had experienced personally with others. And I think also has really created an environment where not only can we be generous, but we've been blessed to be generous, right? We have a friend who says we're blessed to be a blessing. And I think that really is true. And for us, that started in a parking lot with two different numbers and trusting God for the bigger number. And what I would hope that folks would take away from that is generosity is not just for the ultra high net worth or the high net worth, or even those that are making a lot of money. It's for everyone. God is not interested in the zeros. He's interested in the obedience. He wants you to trust him, and he's after your heart. And if you can trust him, he'll show up and he'll be faithful.
Yeah, I love stories like that. And obviously, it is not a guarantee for how it works. But I mean, we have heard enough stories at this point, just like that, where there is a big stretch and then the exact number shows up, in some time afterwards. And I think that is God's way of communicating with us, saying, like, I'm not doing this. It's not a reward. It's not something like that. It is confirmation that you were hearing from me and you took that step that I was inviting you into. You didn't have to do it. I would still love you if you didn't take that step, but you did hear me correctly. And I'm so glad that you did. I want you to know that it was real. And that's why I think those stories exist. And they come up a lot, because I think all of generosity is just a constant back and forth conversation with God. And, he's constantly putting feelers out there and seeing how we respond. And I just think about how many of those opportunities I've missed in my life, but I'm so grateful for the ones that I've said yes to, just like that, because you never forget a story like that.
Well, and I would say, it's not just financial, right? I feel like the Holy Spirit just convicted me of that. We talk about generosity oftentimes limited to finances, and it's our whole life. And so he wants us to give our time. You guys give your time with this podcast. And there are so many who are giving in organizations and churches and just serving those around them, serving on boards, giving their expertise. And I think those are important contributions too. We're stewarding our whole life, not just our financial resources. Again, because he wants our heart. And that's really what he's after.
Well, Kristin, I'd love to hear what you're most excited about when you think about the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, I'm most excited about the opportunity to impact the communities around us and the world through people's generosity, for sure, right? We know we're amidst a significant wealth transfer. That is not just an incredible opportunity for generosity from a donor advised fund perspective. It's an incredible opportunity to activate families around causes that God has put on their heart to go solve problems in our communities, in our country, and the world. So as donor advised funds continue to grow, it's the fastest growing philanthropic tool. I believe donor advised fund sponsors have not only an opportunity, but a responsibility to help families activate those dollars intended for generosity. I also, in addition to that, am really excited about some collaboration I see happening in the space. I say that not to hit a buzzword, but to actually just kind of highlight the opportunity to really accomplish more together. And so where we see groups of donors come together and we see groups of nonprofits and ministries come together, and in the background, we have activation of generosity happening, we really are on a cusp of some pretty significant kingdom work that can be accomplished in the next 5 and 10 years. But it's not going to happen by itself. So we have to champion that effort and really catalyze those conversations and begin that movement and create some momentum around that work that's happening.
Yep. And you and the rest of the Signatry get to be right there in the middle of all of that. Such a cool vantage point to get to see God at work. Well, Kristin, we like to end every episode with our Manager's Minute, just a practical suggestion for our listeners for how they can step into their role as stewards and manage God's wealth wisely. Do you have a suggestion for our listeners today?
I do. I would encourage folks to do something that doesn't make sense. Now, let me explain that just a little bit. I sit in this space. You're right, Keelan. It is an amazing opportunity to see families get excited about generosity and to see business owners save tax and give more significantly. But we often are sitting in this space of a tax advantage. And too quickly, our calculations can become transactions to save tax. And so my encouragement and my experience is to sort of jumpstart that joy in giving, is to do something that otherwise doesn't make sense. My husband and I gave a minivan away probably 10 years ago. We were buying a new vehicle. We had ours serviced and detailed and gave it to a family rather than trading it in. And that might sound simple. It was painful at the time, but there was incredible joy knowing that we were blessing a family with something they otherwise would not have had. It made no financial sense, but I'm talking about it 10 years later, right? It brought great joy to our hearts. So whether it is buying somebody's groceries, whether it is, just doing something that otherwise wouldn't make sense, being extravagantly generous or just slightly generous, whatever you can do that you're not going to record for tax purposes, see if that might spark some joy and reignite your own sort of journey in this thing we call generosity.
Yeah, I think that is a great suggestion. And you're right that is a surefire way to jumpstart joy in giving. And if that has not been something you've experienced, then I absolutely second that recommendation. Kristin, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for being with us. Where can people learn more about the Signatry?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. I would love to engage with folks. Go to thesignatry.com. I would invite you to go see some of our family resources. I think those will be linked in the show notes, but would just love to engage with families and see where they might be able to take their next step in their generosity journey. Awesome.
And I encourage everybody to check that out. Kristin, thanks for sharing your story with us and for being with us today.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show, guys. If you want to find any of our references or links from today's show, you can always find them in our show notes at finishlinepledge.com/episode 174. And if you'd like to get in touch, we'd love to hear from you. Just send us an email at hello@finishlinepledge.com. Now, as most of you know, on the Finish Line podcast, we are all about stories, seeing how God draws us into generosity over a lifetime. But sometimes these stories can leave us thinking, what's the next step look like for me? That's exactly why we've launched a whole new podcast called Applied Generosity, which explores the full landscape of the generous life across 7 different dimensions of generosity. Applied Generosity helps make sense of the hundreds of stories we've shared on the Finish Line podcast to help you find that next best step. If you've been inspired by these stories and want to take things to the next level, check out Applied Generosity wherever you listen to podcasts or at appliedgenerosity.com. That's it for today. We'll see you next time.